Steve's eyes around fraud. So for context, when you talk about fraud, and you ask yourself, a couple things. One is it not a person, right? Something fraud, right? Like, how did that happen, right? Is it the wrong person? Sometimes we talk about friendly fraud, right? Like it went out, it qualified, everything was right, but then someone used the card that wasn't supposed to use the card, right? It's almost like friendly fraud. Right? It happens a lot more than you think, right? Big beneficiaries taking advantage. That also, think about a real person but not eligible. That's a big problem, right? Eligibility is a huge part of fraud across all parts of payments, not just in the disaster space, but eligibility support. And the last piece, it kind of blurs the lines a little bit, and we've heard a lot about it earlier today when we talked about SKU level and SKU X, right? But spend that is going somewhere that it shouldn't be going. So it's intended spend, but it's not going where it was intended to, right? So that is a version of fraud. Again, we get into a little bit of a gray area by definition. I don't think the folks that support me at Visa on the fraud teams would call that fraud, but it's certainly a problem in this space, right? And Bob and the folks have spoken to it today. It's very important. So to kind of kick us off a little bit, I'm going to ask Scott to talk about an article that he penned in May of this year. It was in the Independent Banker. And there were 3 points that I took away from it. They were headed as such, but number one, taking advantage of exhausted people, right? Also, being a trusted source and supporting due diligence. So Scott, can you opine a bit on what you spoke about?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to look at fraud broadly first. I want to zoom out a little bit. And fraud and scams, as we know, has become a huge problem across the ecosystem. And really that's exacerbated by artificial intelligence. You know that fraud and scams have become incredibly sophisticated. And they're incredibly sophisticated, especially for some of the less sophisticated customers that live in rural areas, areas that are operated predominantly by elder folks. And these are a lot of the areas that community banks really focus on. And so as we've gone out and talked to our community bank members, again, thousands of community banks, so we have a really broad geographic breadth there. We found that fraud and scams are really their number one operational issue right now. And so as a result of that, they've gone out and they've put a lot of effort into investing in solutions to detect fraud and scams, but also policies and procedures to make sure that they're monitoring things continuously. One of the benefits that community banks have is that they have really, really close relationships with their customers. The amount of knowledge that community banks have on their customers is incredible. If you walk into a community bank branch, and I don't know if any of you bank with a community bank or a relative who do, you can walk up to a teller line and you can have them ask you, how's your dishwasher? Did you get your dishwasher fixed? How's Mary? How's she doing? Is she feeling better? So we find that community banks have this really inherent strength when it comes to fighting fraud and scams. So recently, in the wake of a number of disasters, especially Hurricane Helene, we went out to our community banks and we asked them, what are you seeing? Are you seeing a proliferation of fraud and scams? The answer, of course, is yes. And these fraud and scams vary in sophistication and the effort required to implement them. So we see things crossing geographies, we see things across different types of technology, we see things that are very simple that just rely on trust. But the other remarkable finding that we had was that these community banks are incredibly well placed to help the customers sort through these fraud and scams and to help them limit the impact. And so from that, we really drew 3 conclusions: that community banks are really valuable in the disaster context as partners, as service providers, and also as educators. And so let me talk about each of those roles that community banks play and some of the value that they bring there. And I think, again, it's important to highlight this because in a lot of the conversations that we have about partnerships, we don't really talk about community banks or community financial institutions more broadly. So it's a really important group to start to bring to this conversation. So when we think of a community bank as a partner, we think of them certainly as a partner to their customers, their clients, because they understand the transactions that they conduct. They understand their needs, they understand their histories. And so when they're presented with something suspicious, they are absolutely ready to step in and to gently, with a human touch, kind of nudge them potentially away from a fraudulent transaction. And that's something that financial institutions that rely purely on automation are unable to do. So we see them as a partner to their clients, but we also see them as partners to community organizations. Community banks have relationships with law enforcement, they have relationships with nonprofits, and these relationships result in information sharing and really, really good just ability to understand what's going on in the community and to telegraph what they see. So really, really valuable partners. The other thing is they're service providers. Community banks have all of the infrastructure in place right now to process legitimate disaster payments. So we look at some of the things that government is doing right now, moving away from paper checks and to electronic disbursements. Community banks are absolutely ready to do that type of work. Then finally, there's an education piece. Because of these close relationships, we see our community banks spending a lot of time going out into their communities before, during, and after disasters, explaining to people this is what you may see, or this is what you're seeing, or this is what you've seen, and making sure that they really get that. They work with law enforcement, again, partnerships to help them understand this is what we're seeing in the bank. So what we really ultimately have come to realize is that the community bank, with their really, really deep ties, is absolutely an essential partner in this disaster response picture. So just a couple of statistics to drive home, and I've done a great job memorizing our ICP talking points. So let me tell you this, that in 1 of 3 US counties, community banks are the only physical banking presence. So if you want to walk into a trustworthy location and talk about money, in a lot of places around the country, a community bank is your only option. And community banks have 45 to 50,000 locations across the country, so that's a substantial presence in those places. So, I think it's really important to underscore when it comes to fraud detection, prevention, and mitigation, community banks are some of the most valuable partners that folks have. And it's really just, again, not clients and customers alone, but also all of the FinTechs, all of the community groups, and really everybody involved in this ecosystem. So in my mind, from what we've seen talking to many of our community banks, they're the hub for disaster recovery. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, really helpful. I think particularly if you live in the metropolis, like some of us, we don't understand that dynamic. So that's really helpful. I want to try and move the discussion around to what we maybe call the vectors, right? Kind of around how. And Trisha, I'm interested to hear from you, from your federal experience, right? Kind of where, how, when, if you will. And then segue that, if you will, to how blockchain can help prevent. So I just want to throw it over to you, talk about fraud, and in your experience, where, when, and how.
Sure. Well, I did present, prepare a PowerPoint, but I don't know, are we able to put that on? I just need to. So, what do I do? Okay. So on the numbers, I don't have the memory that Scott has. Okay, it's forward. So let's be forward. Glasses. From a federal government perspective, there's improper payments and then there's fraud. Improper payments result when the money goes to the wrong place, maybe an administrative error, or a system error, or the wrong amount. And in FY24, improper payments, the government GAO estimates between 162 to 236 billion a year. And over the last 20 years, just speaking of improper payments, that result accumulated to about $2.8 trillion and growing. A lot of money when you consider the size of our debt is about 37 trillion. Let's see. It's easy for me to talk this way. In FY25, for FY25, the GAO added disaster payments to their list of high-risk payments subject to improper payments or fraud. So this is definitely an issue, a growing issue on the federal government side with disaster relief payments. And improper payments are growing, even higher than the pre-pandemic level. Now, improper payments, again, are different from fraud. Fraud results from individuals, mostly the GAO put out a report recently describing that a lot of the fraud, government payments, is coming from organized groups. Some highly organized, where they're divvying up the responsibilities. One responsibility is to capture the stolen PII. Another responsibility may be to launder the money. And so, to me, this kind of creates the landscape for why blockchain might be a solution. Because, and just building on comments made by earlier presenters, there are a lot of themes that I'm hearing in this session, this symposium today. And one is that we need a new framework. We need to rethink entirely how we're moving money for disaster payments. And I would broaden that generally to a new framework is being built, right, using digital assets. This administration, the crypto, king, trying to make the U.S. the crypto capital of the world, is doing a lot. They're taking on a lot of initiatives to lay the framework, the new framework for the financial sector and our payments. And there have been multiple executive orders. There was the July 30th report by the administration on U.S. leadership in digital assets. And all of that is going to be followed by a lot of legislation and regulations. So I think it's an interesting time to be looking at this technology and for a lot of parties here to be exploring it, particularly at the state and local level. So the weakness in the current system is the storage of PII, personally identifiable information. When I worked at Treasury, this was a big thing. We're constantly doing risk assessments around PII, and that led to silos, data silos. So you couldn't share your information with, for example, another agency for fear that you're exposing PII, you're risking the exposure of PII. And In the current system, we have the PII, basically, my name, social security number, date of birth, all of that is stored in a central database maintained by the government. And these honeypots of information, centrally located, sensitive information, personally identifiable information, are prime targets for these organized groups to usurp and then put on the dark web and resell information about which they have then used for fraudulently for claiming federal dollars. So, blockchain, again, I argue, offers a new framework, and I think that it's going to take 5 years. I don't think this is something that will scale in the next year. I think in the next year, following the passage of the Genius Act, we might see a lot more activity. We'll definitely see a lot more activity with stablecoins and a lot of development with wallets and point of sale, getting adoption, using stablecoins with your mobile device and through a merchant. But I think for this group, the more important thing is now is the time to start laying the groundwork, the foundation for a larger strategy, adopting blockchain, and particularly, again, sort of recognizing what's happening with this administration. This point was made repeatedly in today's forum, and that is, we know all of the leadership needs to happen at the state and local level. And so I would argue that the adoption over the next 5 years really needs to happen at the state and local government level. And that's where, and I would advise, that's where resources need to go right now, is building out the infrastructure, building out the capabilities, the on and off ramps for support of blockchain. And the on and off ramps, could entail, on and off, through the Visa network, on and off, or on and off ramp into onto a card, or off ramp on, into a bank account via ACH or FedWire. So, I can't see that too well. I don't want to get too much into the technology. I've written a lot about this, and Kirsten and I met each other through the Faster Payment Council. She led an effort writing a blog on disaster payments, and where we write about how blockchain is really being used globally by the Red Cross, the UN, and successfully in delivering aid to disaster victims. And the benefits primarily speak to a lot of the challenges I heard today. The duplication of efforts, and the slowness, and so what blockchain offers is a shared distributed ledger. Let's see if we got that chart. A shared distributed ledger where all of the stakeholders can view the same real-time, auditable, permanent ledger. You can see, we talked about the end-to-end, you can see where the money originates and and where it's delivered. But importantly, this disaster relief to me is one of the best use cases today because of the stakeholders involved, because of the need for coordination, and because of the fraud, because of the problems, this panel's talking about, and what blockchain enables is a decentralized digital ID. One that is, so today, again, if someone wants to, if I want to apply for a government program and want to verify who I am, the system is set up so that they're going to ping the centralized database to verify I am who I am because my information is verified and stored in the central government database. But I think the future, many of the 10 is the future, are these distributed digital IDs, which are issued by a trusted party, which could be a state government or a bank, and stored decentrally or locally on your device. And I believe this is the future. It may not be tomorrow or the next year, but where we have users are able to control who they expose their information to. And I'll just sort of end on this note that a lot of action, again, is coming out of this administration, both on, of course, we know FEMA, empowering the states to lead disaster relief efforts, and also lots coming out of this administration in support of digital assets, blockchain, and self-custody type digital IDs, which I believe really address and solve the fraud and improper payments problem.
Tricia, can I try and say that back to you?
Yes.
So, Bobby UX has a company that was built around blockchain. And by doing that, Bobby's company has a great story to be told about fraud, right? Today, a lot of the partners in the room, some of the nonprofits and NGOs in the room, there's not a blockchain provider here. It's part of a technology stack. Is that safe to say? It's a technology that resides somewhere, right, in a stack. Is that fair?
Well, you're testing my level of technical expertise, but I'm going to answer.
By no means am I trying to do
No, I'm going to answer. So, first of all, I believe Bobby is building blockchain networks right now and has plans to. But there's one company that is Metallicus, who is a member of the Faster Payment Council, who's working with me now on a blockchain use case blog, so look for that. And their primary clients are credit unions.
Okay.
They are
So there are
building
service,
blockchain ecosystems.
so there are service providers on the horizon that can bring this to life. Because the woman from John Spoke about putting cards in people's hands, essentially gift cards, right? So in my observation over the last few years in this space, we are in some of these very large NGOs are still using physical plastic, and then we take this discussion to the other end where you're residing today, talking about blockchain. So that's kind of my contextual point of how far left and right we go in this discussion. And those of you that have dialed in or in the room are somewhere in the middle of that, right? So let's go to the middle of that. Let's talk to Zach, and let's hear from Kevin. Back to the vectors of fraud, kind of where, how, and when. Hopefully these are good stories you can tell. But Kevin, anything you can share from your experience for the last 7 years at St. Vincent de Paul, where there has been fraud, or you're fighting fraud, and where it's important from a payment standpoint?
Yeah, I think not just the St. Vincent de Paul. I remember Hurricane Laura, where FEMA was doing a lot of their big payments programs, and they found out that 80% of the applications were from a Ukrainian IP address. So it's not just nonprofits, it's the federal government. I've worked internationally where as soon as a physical card is distributed, within 15 minutes it disappears into a tent and a duplicate is made. 15 minutes. Fraud's everywhere. I mean, we have a furniture program, and I believe that when there ever is a benefit to be given, there is a way to defraud that, right? Our largest program is called House in the Box. We provide furniture to folks. I tell people all the time, we're not the world police. If we give people furniture, they can go on Facebook Marketplace tomorrow and sell it for cash. I think it's more about the mitigation. There's a lot of things that we're seeing within the United Nations. One of the SDGs and the sub-SDGs is that everyone will have identity by 2030. Why can't that be digital identity? I'm not an expert on fraud, but I do have experience leveraging blockchain to mitigate against fraud. And I do think, if there are Afghani women that can use biometrics to get their food through a World Food Program, there's no way that the United States can't catch up and start to use the technology. And I really hope it's not 5 years, but the reality is it might be even longer. And I only get so upset because this is the 20th anniversary of Katrina, and I look at my colleagues around the room, Marcus and Zach and others, and I just don't know what has changed. And I really believe that we can't let that happen in another 20 years to look back and say, what have we done? And I really do hope that this administration, I hope that the private sector, we can take this technology seriously, take it in stride. And I really hope that we can challenge that 5 years. But I'll turn it over back to you, Joe. Or
Zach.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I'm going to piggyback a little bit on what one of the things you touched on there, Kevin, is, one of the other things that we do, aside from some direct cash support to survivors, is also in kind. We have a couple of warehouses we provide for cleanup buckets, hygiene kits, security packs, so on and so forth. And you can't mitigate all the fraud, right? There's nothing preventing somebody from taking those supplies in that bucket and going and selling them. And unfortunately, we actually had instances, this was before my time at the CWS, where we were providing supplies to like a local non-profit organization, and they were selling the supplies, right? So fraud happens on all kinds of levels. I think the thing that I want to talk about, and I'm no fraud expert by any stretch of the imagination, right? I think the thing that I want to go back to is, we heard a couple of panelists today talk about the fact that disasters begin and end locally, right? We've also heard people talking about, like, you need to develop the relationships, with other stakeholders in the, for-profit, non-profit, private and governmental sector prior to the disaster, right? It's not after the disaster happens. It's not 2 days before the hurricane hits, those types of things. And I would say that, that same principle applies at the local community level with the potential survivor or the potentially impacted, population, right? And so to your point about the community-based banks that are there that have those relationships, and so one of the ways, as far as with my organization, that we're trying to at least mitigate fraud, as much as we can, is making sure that we're not parachuting into a community where we don't have already pre-established relationships with community-based organizations, with local houses of worship, with business or local government, emergency management, all those kinds of things, because they're the ones that can verify, right? That Scott is who he says he is, that Scott lives in the in the impact zone, right? That Scott has need, and so much of this, we're talking a lot about technology, and I really hear about believe in products and technology and how we can make things better. But it's not a silver bullet, at least not yet. Maybe it will be in the future, I don't know. But there still has to be that kind of human touch. And unfortunately, I think as AI continues to progress, it's only going to be even more important back in time to be able to verify that Scott is who he says he is, and that he's a real person, that he exists, and all these kinds of things, and that he does have needs. So I think it's not an either or, it's a both and, right? And it comes down to community resilience, it comes down to relationships, it comes down to building those networks in advance in order to be able to mitigate the fraud. And then also to be able to use the technology that's there right now and leverage the absolutely amazing aspects of that technology to make sure that people are spending the money on the things that it's meant to be spent on, to make sure that it's going to the right people and that we're able to track and provide the data so that things do change. So that 20 years from now, I probably won't be around, at least in this case, I hope I'm retired by then. 20 years from now, we're not having the same conversation where things have changed. It's like, okay, there's not this massive level of fraud that's happening at the federal level that's impacting all the taxpayers that's happening at the private level with philanthropy and so on and so forth. So I'll stop there. I think it goes.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback off that real quick. I mean, there are measures that are being taken. Look at Texas; it's a home rule state. They don't even let you into the state. The judges have the sheriffs at the county line. They don't know who you are. Now, this isn't financial. This is for those scamming, contractors that come in and want to, fix your roof and take your money, and after 2 days they leave. But we see this in the FinTech space with putting guardrails on what the money is used for. And I'm probably going to offend some people here, but I think we need to do better in being more intentional with the money that we give out. And so understanding the survivor journey from the very beginning all the way to recovery, what it is that they need to be using the money for. So for instance, I think that we would be able to mitigate fraud if we put more restrictions on the funds that are given to the individual. So in month one, maybe it's the fund, you get $1,000 and it's only for hotel stays. You can't use it anywhere else. I mean, obviously there's no liquor stores, tobacco, firearms, things of that nature already inherently built in as protections. But I do think that if we became more intentional and understood the survivor journey better, made our interventions more intentionally, and put those super restrictions on those dollars, I think we might be able to see a little bit more less fraud as it relates to just not being able to just have the money to use however they so choose. But yeah, go ahead.
Do you mind if I jump in?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think, and to that point too, I think so much of this is intertwined and somewhat complex. It's complex, but it's not rocket science either, right? And I think some of the challenges you talk about, like being able to use the money for temporary housing or maybe fuel or something, people need to evacuate. The biggest challenge that I think we face within the sector is the information sharing. Because, so for instance, like CWS, we have an MOU with Airbnb.org, right? So oftentimes we're providing temporary housing. Well, Kevin's organization may not know that we just provided temporary housing to client X, right? And so he's like, hey, here's money for you to go get a hotel, but they're already staying in an Airbnb, that we provided or whatever it is. And so I don't have the answers for that. Maybe it is blockchain, but there's, I think that's one of the big flies in the ointment here, right? We can talk all day about FinTech and those types of things, but left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. At the federal, state, private, nonprofit level, it becomes a challenge.
And I want to talk about information sharing a little bit in a slightly different context, because one of the things that we've seen in the community banking space that's been extremely effective is creating local networks of law enforcement and multiple community banks to share fraud information. Now, it doesn't work at the national level because there's a lot of complexity around legislation, regulation, just the logistics of facilitating that type of conversation. But it strikes when you're hearing this conversation that those very effective information sharing networks typically don't include disaster response organizations. And so perhaps there's an opportunity to amplify the value of including some of those folks. And it really also gets to some of the conversation we had about the pre-plan, right? We bring folks in early to these information sharing networks rather than just when we're dealing with the disaster itself. So maybe there's opportunities to leverage some of these structures that are already in place and to expand membership and really just build on that information sharing technology that we're starting to see within the financial services sector.
Can I just build on that? I just want to make the point that again, this administration is making it a priority to combat fraud and improper payments, and they initiated a big effort to improve data sharing across governments, across silos in the government. And I think, for all the criticism this administration gets, I look for opportunities for, positive development, and I think this, I think they're doing a good job laying out the framework for this type of work, improving information sharing. And so to your point, Joe, what can happen between now and 5 years, from now? There's the technology piece to the blockchain, but there's also the standardization of information. We know, for example, that a big impediment to cross-blockchain and cross-border payments, and cross-border payments is another really good use case for blockchain. The big impediment is not the technology, it's the different disparate regulatory regimes around the world, and that's where we're stuck, trying to resolve that. So between now and 5 years from now, the experts could be working on standardizing data so that it is shared and under the umbrella of these Trump initiatives.
So I'd like to put out a call for action that Spur is a great idea. I don't know, is anybody familiar with the recent request for information that was issued by the OCC, the Fed, and the FDIC on payments fraud?
Absolutely.
Okay, so there's an RFI on the street right now. It's been on the street now for about 2.5 months, so the comment due is September 18th. And it asks a broad array of very high-level questions about what the regulators could be doing about fraud. It does not allude to disaster fraud, but it's very, very open-ended. And I think it would be an incredible opportunity to see folks come forward and say, yes, we need more data sharing, yes, we need more collaboration around disaster-related fraud. Because there are sections explicitly addressing data sharing. What kind of data should we be sharing? How should we do that? So these RFIs can be fairly complicated. This one is 26 questions, and they're extremely broad and open-ended. You don't have to answer all the questions, but the impact of having a group of letters come forward saying disaster fraud is a problem and we need to do something about it would be really, really valuable. So I'll encourage you all right now to take a look at that RFI, and if you feel so inclined, if your organizations feel so inclined, there's a real opportunity to start to push some of these things. And I will tell you that the regulators are listening. ICBA and other trade associations have been pushing now for a couple of years to see coordinated action from the regulators in terms of fraud and scams work. And right now they're all very, very engaged. And so I feel very bullish that when some of these suggestions come forward, they're going to be taken really, really seriously. So please think about it, take a look at it. You've got a couple weeks to write, to make your pitch. Very simple, but a real good opportunity for all of us here.
Can I just quickly add to that? There's another RFI that came out recently, and it's a follow-up to the Genius Act, and it's on the same thing, innovative methods to combat illicit activity, but it focuses on digital assets. And comments are due on that RFI October 17th.
Thank you both for those call-outs. I want to close, first of all, open up to any questions that you all might have. I don't know if there's any folks who dialed in, but any questions for our panelists? Marissa?
So, Joe, it's Richard Sealine. Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Make an observation. Good afternoon. Zach, I want to first off thank you for the work that your organization did here in Houston and continues to do. It goes proof positive that faith-based institutions, no matter what faith, come in and do the work, and often are not persistently recognized. So Zach, thank you for the work that y'all did. Two observations and leads to both the same question. One is the overall fraud that was occurring for quite some time, sad but true, was that individuals being bussed in from outside jurisdictions, getting underneath the tents without ability to justify address, need, and location, and leaving. That supposedly has been somewhat addressed, but what I'm hearing from time to time is that we're having to repeat the same stand-up, and that there's no kind of universal way to get before the next event some structure in place. That's number one. Number two, to the point, Tricia, that you said about blockchain, one of the other failures that seems to keep on occurring is we don't know where all the supplies are, even before the next event. So HEB Grocers down here, great example, knows where to water, knows how to get generators and all, but even some of the state and local elected officials we found sometimes don't know where certain things are. Is there a way to connect the blockchain capabilities in the financial interest so that we can truly know where supplies are and know where and how to deliver those supplies to the individuals that need it the most?
I would say yes, and I turn to Bobby, who's building these networks, if we can expand on that. I think the answer to the question is yes. Blockchain is ideal for supply chain management, for example. So I don't know, Bobby, if you had anything to add.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And blockchain, at the end of the day, is a source of truth. So I think when we talk about standards, you have to start with what is the source of truth in that standard, and that's where you kind of collaborate and say, what do we need to track? Because ultimately, it's technology that can connect interaction from consumer to product. But not every permutation is going to go live in the first phase. And that's the challenge with blockchain. We were talking earlier, Trish and I, blockchain is such a technical conversation that's part of its challenge. It's transformational technology, but it doesn't have this way to translate itself into the real world. But when you talk about tracking goods, if I have a source of truth, so if I have a unique identifier that's serialized, that's associated to the payments funds that I'm delivering to, let's say, the survivor, and it's associated at a SKU level within a point of sale to be able to attribute that to a specific product. And if the retailer is opting into that database and that information is being tracked as well, again, some of this is 5-10 years out to the full life cycle, being there. You actually have an end-to-end traceability, payment, product ecosystem. That's the potential's there. And we're building large parts of this, but you have to start at that foundational level. You have to get the foundation right to be able to build upon it. So there is no one size fits all that's going to happen tomorrow in blockchain. I think that's what everybody understands here. But you have to build that way if you truly want to reach the promised land, which we all do. And I think that the time is now, and we have the right regulatory environment here in the U.S. to make that happen.
So Bobby, when a bunch of us worked on getting the crowdfunding legislation passed, leading all the way up to the SEC approving it, one of the things, again, I think this panel reinforces, and some of y'all have said this in one way or another, and it goes to something the person I've been talking about. We need to find a pilot. I think we're going to have to self-fund a pilot to prove from end to end that Treasury, the states can see what we had to do on crowdfunding, which was basically a no joke. Can't remember her first name, the Shapiro, who was the chairwoman of the SEC. She said basically to us, I can't afford to have 3 Russians in a basement in Brooklyn ripping off grandma. That was the benchmark she used publicly. So I think, if there is a way, Joe, for again, us to find a way to design something that is somewhat end-to-end as a pilot and be able to demonstrate its effectiveness, it will help to the point, Kevin, I think that you raised, or somebody raised, or Scott, I'm not sure who, raised about that, yes, the administration is looking for feedback, but the best feedback is to be able to show that there is some alignment on a pilot that can be demonstrated.
Can I just add, just to remind everyone, the state of Wyoming just recently issued its own state coin. And they have done a lot of work developing a legislative framework to operate blockchain, crypto in that state. And so they're done with that chapter, just issued the state coin. They've got a live system. And the next chapter is leveraging that technology, that experience to other states. It's literally could be a copy and paste exercise, recognizing every state is different, and of course we have to be customized to that state. But so, state of Wyoming is out in the forefront, and I think can serve as a role model for other state governments.
Thank you, everybody, for your time, attention, questions to your panelists. Thank you, everybody.